listening in on some great conversations. And I just encourage you to do it. So our rugby girls, continue to have that conversation about what biases and privileges that you have. I find with a lot of sports, especially sports where you don't go on to sign a 6-year, $50 million contract, that a big chunk of sports, always prior sports that I want to see as a coach, is we want to make you not only the better athletes, but the better people. So I always encourage those conversations to happen. Those coaches who are in the room, these are conversations that you can have with your athletes. And the reality is that while your athletes, depending on how, they may not necessarily know the terms that we talk about here, but they come from diverse and inclusive classrooms, so they understand the general concepts. And we're going to talk about this as we do a deeper dive into allyship now. So what is allyship? Somebody who advocates or actively works for inclusion of marginalized groups, not as a member of that group. So I have here in bold, advocates and actively works in all areas of society. So the reason why I bring it up is because really there's two types of allyship. There's performative allyship and there's active allyship. And one is better than the other. So if we look at performative allyship, performative allyship, we'll just grab it. Here we go. Performative allyship is usually done to increase social capital. So let me give you an example. Shortly after the murder of George Floyd, there were a lot of people from all walks of life trying to figure out what is it exactly that I can do. And one of the things that happened on Instagram in particular was Blackout Tuesday, or at least that's what I think it was called. The younger ones can tell me if I'm wrong. For me personally, it was really cool to go onto my Instagram timeline and see all the black squares. However, the problem was the next day, 95% or more of those black squares went back to whatever you were talking about before. So maybe it was Miley Cyrus, maybe it was your favorite boy band, maybe it was your favorite sports team, so on and so forth. That's very much performative allyship. When we walk around and wear that pink t-shirt for one day of the year, when we wear that orange t-shirt during Truth and Reconciliation, that's very much performative allyship. That does not mean that allyship can't start from there. But what is it that you're doing within your day-to-day life to be an ally to another historically marginalized group? For example, one of the things that I do, and I don't brag about it, is a lot of things I do around allyship, I do in silence. I don't brag about them with social media, I do it. For example, my barber is a female Indigenous barber from the Millbrook First Nation. I make a point of trying to shop not only local, but from local Indigenous artists and from local Black artists. Again, it's not something that I run around, but it's just something that I do. You can operate in silence without looking for that social credit and be an ally. You can donate money to groups who support historically marginalized communities and be an ally now. But there are also other ways as a coach or sport administrator you can be an ally. You can be intentional to promote a culture of inclusion. So like I talked about earlier, I don't necessarily need your whole team to wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts or wear the orange t-shirts. Look at your practice, look at your tournament, look at that sporting environment and ask the question, is this practice, is this piece of my sport environment as inclusive as it could be? And do some self-reflection, because if the answer is no, there are small little changes that you can make. So for example, you can have these conversations with your athletes and build them in, actually we'll talk about that in a moment, let's skip that, sorry. In terms of what more you can do, you can have some self-reflection. So whether it's now, what's on the drive home, about what you can do about being now. The biggest thing is when you see racism or discrimination, whether it's towards Black person, Indigenous person, or even if it's, I shouldn't say it only, but if it's a man insulting a woman, perhaps it's gender discrimination, whatever that is, when you see it, call it out And if you don't necessarily feel comfortable or safe calling it out, after the discrimination has happened, go to the person who's on the bad end of that and ask them, are you okay? Is there anything I can do in the moment to support you? Empathy goes a long way in terms of being an ally. Goes a very long way. And the reality is that Muslim joke, that black joke, that blonde joke, that really isn't all that funny. If you have to put down one group to make another group laugh, you really need to ask the question of what exactly is the purpose of this. Becoming the king and queen of questions, like we talked about earlier. Asking those questions, learning more, educate yourself. So do more than just that Wikipedia education, to go online, to learn more about what is unconscious bias, to learn more from people like Dr. Sylvia Duxworth or Sandra Levy, who's the chief people officer with the Canadian Olympic Committee. There's a whole bunch of people out there who, quite frankly, are far smarter than me, who put in papers in different research papers similar to this one online that you can learn about. And accept feedback. So if you slip up and make a mistake, it's one thing if a racial slur. So if you call somebody else the N-word, okay, we really need to have more than just a talk there. But if you slip up and call somebody by a term that's considered offensive, if somebody comes to you and says, no, we shouldn't refer to Indigenous people in that manner. No, we shouldn't refer to women in that manner. Don't get defensive and say, well, this is what my grandpa did, this is what we've always done, and this is what I'll continue to do. It doesn't matter whether you think it's offensive or not. Take that in, apologize, be empathetic, and do different, do better the next time. Allyship with athletes and parents. So introducing these topics as part of your team culture, rules, and expectations. It can be something as simple as racism and discrimination will not be tolerated within this team, within this organization, whatever that is. And not only saying that, but explaining why that is. And you feel free to use my example of the little Indigenous girl having a different experience than everybody else and explain why that's not okay. Again, our athletes, our kids, they come, and even the world is much more diverse and inclusive than it once was. These topics might be uncomfortable to some of the athletes, depending on their age, but it doesn't mean it's nothing that they haven't experienced before. So including them in your team's culture, rules, and expectations. Truly acknowledging any and all issues. So as coaches or sport administrators, if somebody comes up to you, talk about racism that they would have felt, or discrimination that they would have felt. What has historically happened to me, especially with those microaggressions that we talked about earlier? So you're really well spoken for a black person, or I didn't realize black people played soccer. I thought you played track because you're super quick. Go up and have a conversation with your coach and not brushing that off. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Empathy and listening goes a very long way. And if you can show that to your athlete, it will help you in the long run to be able to deal with these issues, whether or not you think it's super important or not. The reality is that athlete has approached you as a person, as a leader, as a person of trust to deal with this issue. And it's important that you deal with it accordingly. Reinforce these things, especially during the tough times. So if you've gone your way and introduced these topics as part of your rules and expectations, but then there's an incident that happens and nothing is done about it, it's no different than any other role. Your athletes will see this and say, well, all that equity, diversity, inclusion talk we had, that's really not important because coaches are dealing with this. And that message goes on, and then next thing you know, it just devolves from there. And the reality is that you've wasted your time to take that and input that into your team's culture. Continuous education and continuous asking questions. It doesn't need to be part of every practice or every piece that you do, but some of the exercises that we've gone through earlier, talking about what equity, diversity, inclusion is. What are some biases and privileges that you have? What are some things that you can do as a team to help those who historically have not been, like we talked about earlier, have not been included in the sport? All those things can be part of your team and help educate them as well, because sport, we want to not only not make great athletes, but we want to make great individuals as they go off into society. And then if you don't know the answer towards a question or issue, go find out. Whether that's reaching out to me, so my business card, Chris's business card, is included in each one of those red folders. So I encourage you to grab one if you haven't already, whether it's doing some research. And if it's something that one of the two of us don't know about, I'm very privileged to get to work with individuals across the country, most of whom are quite smarter than me, and I can go out and find the answer. Really, my job is to support you as coaches to create that inclusive environment. That's my primary role on top of supporting BIPOC coaches, because we recognize that some of the barriers they face are a bit different than everybody else. But that's what I get paid the big bucks for, at least what my son thinks are big bucks. Now we've done all that, let's sort of pivot here as we're sort of wrapping up in our last half hour, go towards tips to create a successful program. So one of the things to keep in mind, so there needs to be an acknowledgement of the problem and a real desire for change within the organization. So there's one organization that I work with, actually, I only know why I'm tiptoeing around it. It's our NSO for Growth. And one of the things that they've talked about often historically is that there is a business case to be made to be more diverse and more inclusive. And the reality is that so curling is a sport that historically has attracted older white people. Well, if you look at demographics, that group is getting smaller, while a more diverse group is getting larger. So it makes sense to start to market towards different groups. But the reality is that whether it's a sports team, whether it's a sport organization, if you look at whether it's those who are new to Canada, whether it's Black people, Indigenous people, if you look at them strictly as dollar signs, that empathy, that inclusion part is going to be missing when something happens. Because change isn't easy. And usually the two reasons why change doesn't happen is number one, we're either super comfortable with where we're at, or number two, you're absolutely terrified of what change looks like. And as you go to be more inclusive, you will run into those people. Develop trust in with the community in which you're working with. So I always say to work with the community, you have to work with the community. Just sorry, to do work with the community, I can even say you have to work with the community. What that means is if I'm working to bring a sport to a local Indigenous group, it's one thing for me to get $10,000 worth of equipment, plop that into that First Nations community and say, go play sport. But what's important is before you even go and get that money, get that equipment, have a conversation with that community as to what does rugby look like within your community? What does soccer look like within your community? What does curling look like within your community? And to take those notes and have that be the basis of the program in which you create. Because at the end of the day, if your program looks different than anything else that you've previously done, so long as little Johnny or little Susie isn't hurting themselves or somebody else, what difference does it make if it looks different than anything you've ever done? Like really, self-reflect on that. Why does it have to be the same as anything else that you've ever done? It can be different, and that's okay. And so that goes back to the program should be based on the needs and desires of the community. The next bullet, the third to last bullet, is something that I've spent a lot of time lobbying to those who make a whole lot more money than me and are the power makers at the table. In order to create programs for historically marginalized communities, especially in sport where we talk about construct, create by white people, usually white men, for rich white men, we need to focus more on the quality of the program instead of sustainability. Here's the last of my hot takes. Once you have a quality program or a proof of concept, finding money for it is not hard. It takes a little bit of work, a little bit of research, but it's really not all that hard. So we have our friends over at Sport Nova Scotia who have a specific grant dedicated towards EDI. They also have their general sport fund, which goes to create more community sport opportunities. There's so many organizations out there. I'm very privileged with the work that I did with the Black Rock Initiative. Once we did a piece that was on Sportsnet, we had both the private and public sector reaching out to us to give us money versus us going the other way around. I promise you, once you have that proof of concept and have those conversations with some of the community, it may take some time, but the funds will find you. So that goes back to doing your research on available grants and seeking feedback from all participants. So the first time you go to the TRIBE program, you had the conversation with community, you bring that support into the community. It may not work perfectly the first time. It may not work perfectly the second or third time. But really, rather than just taking failure as, well, that's the end, we screwed up, let's move on. Find out why. So we brought curling, we as in the Black Rock Initiative, we introduced curling to the Millbrook First Nation. And we did this through a floor curling set. So it's basically playing curling in the gym versus on the ice. The first night we tried it was a Wednesday night. There were 2 little girls who showed up. And I'm looking around with our partners at Millbrook. Like, what exactly did we do wrong here? Why are there only 2 kids here? So regardless, had an awesome time with those kids, showed them curling. One of the fathers came to pick them up towards the end. And he said, you know, it's a shame that you're not doing this on a night because more people will come. Next door is an introduction to drumming that's happening, and there's 15 to 20 kids over there right now. So then we realized, well, maybe we should have been a bit smarter in planning what time we have this event at. So based on that feedback, we changed the time. And the next time we had 8 kids show up. And the time after that, we had 12 kids show up. But that was simply by not saying, okay, well, we only had 2 kids come, this is a failure, let's scrap it. Let's ask some questions, get some feedback from the community, and adjust accordingly. It's really important to fail fast and fail forward. So if you've quote unquote failed, again, it's not the end. It's taking feedback from that and asking what can we do to change? And then going back to what I talked about earlier that I forgot to mention about the needs and desires of the community. Understand what your sport looks like to that community. So going back to curling, because that's the sport I know. When we worked with our partners at the Boys and Girls School of Preston, they told us point blank that curling is a sport for rich white people. Rather than argue that point, because it's not technically true, that's the perception, and that's the reality in which we're dealing with. So then we need to take those barriers that exist and create an image and pick them up one by one by one. And that's sort of how we got to sort of the path that we're at. But the model itself, whether it's curling, whether it's another sport, it can work across other sports. The reason why I know that is because the model that we use, we took from hockey and their Black Youth Ice Hockey program. It was not something that I created. And that's the other part too. You do not need to start from scratch, right? Look to other programs that have worked with historically marginalized communities. Find out what they did well. Most programs, it's not a secret thing. They'll share with you what really worked and what didn't work. And the other part too is when you're going into these historically marginalized communities, work with those who are already working within those communities versus just plastering up a poster on a First Nations community or within say, North Preston, as an example. There are groups out there, whether it's the Boys and Girls Club, in Millbrook, it's the Millbrook Health Center. Throughout each of the First Nations communities, there's a Mi'kmaq physical activity leader who usually is trying to find different and unique ways to work with that community. Reach out to them and have those conversations with them. Going back to what I talked about earlier, the reality is that when we look at a sport as this rectangle model, it's a beautiful rectangle, you know, nice and smooth, the edges look nice. But we're trying to take that rectangle, fit into that circle. The reality is we need to modify that rectangle in order for it to fit. It doesn't mean that that rectangle sucks or it's broken. It just means we need to modify things and tweak things in order for the sport to be inclusive towards everyone. The one thing that I really want to focus on tonight is for you to recognize is that this is just the beginning. So we've only scratched the iceberg on a lot of different topics. And as one person told me after a session we did the last week in Yarmouth, It was a lot like drinking from a fire hose. This is just the beginning of your journey in EDI. One of the things that used to be a safe sport, it doesn't exist anymore. If you ever took safe sport like 5, 6 years ago, it used to say at the end, you are now safe sports certified. Go on your way, and I can't remember the exact language, but it always drove me nuts. It's like, this isn't the end of your safe sport journey. This is just the beginning. And that's the same thing tonight. This isn't the end of your journey along EDI. This is just the beginning. And what I encourage you to do, even if you've got everything else to say, you forget my mom, you forget my name and all that other stuff. One of the things that I've done, this has completely changed the way I look at this and completely changed my life, if I'm being very honest, is every morning when I wake up, I ask myself, what can I do? Whether it's one thing, whether it's 10 things, it can be small, it can be big. What's the one thing I can do today to close that gap that we talked about earlier so that sport becomes more inclusive? Maybe it's a phone call conversation with a tennis group in Truro. Maybe it's a conversation with a basketball organization in Sydney. What's the one thing that I can do today? And that's what I encourage you to do. You don't need to change the world overnight. A lot of people ask me, it's like, how do you get to the point of creating this program to being featured on Sportsnet? It's like, well, my wife can tell you there's a lot of sleepless nights, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of failure that's involved in it. It just doesn't happen overnight. But what it took was a lot of just jumping off the metaphorical cliff and just trying something. And that's why I encourage you, what is it that you're going to try next week, next month, next year to close that gap? And know that not only are Kirsty and I here to help you, I can't speak for Kirsty, but I will be your chief cheerleader if that's what it takes for you to make that difference. Because again, I'm assuming you're all here tonight because we recognize that that gap isn't okay. So what are we going to do to slightly close that gap? And coaches, I'm sure you've seen this 10,000 times before, your NCCP learning, start, stop, continue. So we don't need to do this right now, but during that self-reflection, what are you going to start doing as part of your sport environment? What are you going to stop doing? And what are you going to continue to do? Again, you don't need to change the world, but we need to think about what can we do to be more inclusive. So to my friends online, I apologize about the technical difficulties that we have. I will make a point of emailing the presentation out to everybody within the next day or two. Our email addresses are there on the screen. They're also in business cards for the group here in person. And as well as I encourage you to reach out if you have any questions or concerns along the way. Like I said earlier, this is the first time we've gotten together in person for the last couple of years. This will not be the last time we get together in person over the next couple of years. I look forward to seeing you all again as we sort of go out and into our own specific coaching trainings. But with that said, I do want to open the floor to questions. Kathy.
It's not a question, Andrew. It's just a comment. I definitely have my biases and prejudices, so I am not the perfect person. But I'd like to throw you a challenge.
Sure.
As an advocate and as an ally.
Mm-hmm.
That a number of these young women here are involved in varsity women's sport and so on. And 3 times you've referred to them as girls. And I, as a woman, appreciate that by a particular age and stage of development for the women that they are considered women. Boys are boys, men are men, girls are women. And you know, there's a line. You know, in curling, it's junior women. It's no longer girl stuff. So I just appreciate you recognizing that as an ally and advocate for women, gender. Thanks.
No, of course, no, and thank you for that, Kathy. And ladies, I'd like to apologize about that. It wasn't mine. We did not come from a spot. No, and of course, and I mean, again, it's recognizing that I have biases and privileges, and one of the things that I'm trying to work on, as Kirsty can tell you, is I'm trying to work better in the gender equity space. Again, I have biases and privileges as a male, but again, I apologize for not referring to you as the awesome young women that you are. So my apologies about that. Thank you, Kathy, for pointing that out. I really appreciate that. Yes.
Can
It's all good.
you talk a little bit about, you said like, when you were going in with the Black Rock program, there was a lot of initial perceptions at the start that people had like biases. How did you, like, what were the actual steps that you took, or like, what were some of the creative solutions that you found to get past the biases?
So what we really tried to focus on, we talked about earlier, on the perception of curling within the community. So really what we wanted to do was slowly but surely dismantle this perception. So show that curling is a sport that everybody belongs. If we go back to the belonging era. So we talked about what the sport is. We talked about the intricacies of sport, but we also just talked about having fun with the sport too. So through the 4 curling sets, we introduced them, did a little bit of terminology, but it was really about sliding the rocks back and forth. It was really about developing trust. Because if you don't have trust within the community, and actually thank you, that was an important point that I forgot to bring up. You won't be able to go anywhere. So my grandmother lives in East Preston, just down the road on Brooks Drive. And one of the things she told me when I took on this job is she said, Andrew, every February, a number of sports come in. And when March 1st hits, a number of sports leave. Because quite frankly, they're trying to check a box, as my grandma says, but they never develop trust in that community. So what we're doing is not only trying to teach them a sport, we're trying to show that we are an ally. And sport, not only because curling is what you can try, but it's curling through us individual system. We want to be trusted members of your community. So it's really about developing trust and going from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How long did that take?
So our organization has existed for a year. We started having conversations in community with the community leaders beginning in late May. And then we didn't start to introduce floor curling until mid-September once school got back in. And we were able to work around some of the COVID barriers that we faced. That was actually one of our biggest challenges, was being able to, in particular with the community, the Boys and Girls Club of Preston, they're physically in the school. So we actually had to deliver this outside, and of course, rain gets in the way, but it took several months to really develop that trust and have those conversations where we felt comfortable enough to go in and create that change. Yes?
Yeah, and I just want to touch on your point with developing trust. Like for myself, I'm actually go to social learning. So when I go into my own community, even for myself, I'm on a research project with Cal, and I have to build that trust. Even though they already know who I am, I'm coming in at with different topics and things that they're not aware of or fully educated on. So then it's like I have to build another barrier of trust with them so that they understand like what it is that I need out of them and how I'm actually trying to help them, even though they already do. So it's like really hard. But
Yeah, exactly. It's I thank you for bringing it up. It's 100% the case. So while I have family who live in East Preston, I do not necessarily have a ton of family who live in North Preston and Cherrybrook. Plus, I live in Toronto. I no longer live within that community. So even though I am Black, it's not as if I just have like a card that I can just sort of slap down. Hey, I'm Black. We're going to go ahead and do this. It takes that trust every time. So thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions? So I'm going to stick around here for a few more minutes as we sort of tidy things up. Were there any questions on the chat?
not yet, but it's awesome.
Perfect. So again, my business cards, Chris's business cards are on the table. Encourage you to stick around and ask these questions if you don't feel comfortable asking in a larger group. But with that said, again, thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. And I look forward to seeing you again at another event in the future.